So you can hear Leo in the background, chewing on his dog food, and I'm not going to wait to begin this video for him to finish. I'm gonna just start right here and concede that that background noise is part of the environment in which this discussion is going to be situated. Just like these leaves in this garden, and the placement of these very, very British Victorian tea settings and placements are part of the environment in this image of Jimi Hendrix holding one of his guitars. And this is one of the last images of Hendrix, taken sometime in September 1970, just before he died. And I'm going to actually talk about the death of Hendrix today, which I haven't spoken of before, and I'm going to talk about it in relationship to my rather complicated relationship with Jimi Hendrix, and how I've configured that relationship often in terms of space-time travel. And I've told the story of taking my first and last SAT test, and because of certain limitations that I have, how painful getting through this test was, and I've talked about these hallucinations that I had of this Hendrix-like guitar playing, and loud, but no one else, really responding to it in this setting, and becoming, much more interested in this feedback-ridden guitar playing, acoustic guitar playing, soloing, and this synthy sound that it had than I was in continuing, taking the test. And it was actually quite a relief, from the anxiety, of filling out these little Scantron markings, and and often getting lost in the process of completing them, and having to go back and feeling under the pressures of time, as well as the ordinary constraints of the pain that I suffer when I do things that are handwritten. So I've talked about that, but I haven't, talked about, other space-time travel experiences that I've had that relate to Hendrix. And I haven't talked about Hendrix's death, and how, in some ways, my first experience, or one of the experiences that I had, that involve a proximity to Hendrix, has very much to do with parallels between an experience that I had and Jimi Hendrix's death. So that's what I want to talk about today. The first thing that I want to talk about is how messy accounts of Hendrix's death actually are. And the one thing that we do know, and most of us agree on, is that he died as the result of an asphyxiation of vomit, and of the blockage of his air passages, and And that we know that at some point, an ambulance was called, emergency services were notified, and they arrived. And then, beyond that, we have stories. And the stories are full of contradictions and discrepancies. And I want to talk about, some of those contradictions and some of those discrepancies. One contradiction involves this story, with Eric Burden and this note that Hendrix was said to have written, that some people refer to as a poem that's called "The Story of My Life." Now, Eric Burden tells a story about finding this poem and interpreting it as a suicide note. But then he later retracts that story and says that he was confused about the situation. There's been contention about cleaning up evidence of drug use at the scene or whatever. But one of the things that really interests me is that this little poem, "The Story of My Life," and it should be obvious to anyone who's even paid the most cursory attention to Hendrix's work and lyricism, that the poem resembles nothing of Hendrix writing itself. And I would argue from formal evidence of these phrases on a piece of paper, that it wasn't written by Jimi Hendrix at all. And if that is in fact the case, and the only evidence I have of this, doesn't really belong to handwriting or anything else, it belongs to the formal construction of the note. And the thing about Hendrix is he wasn't a writer like I'm a writer, in the sense that I don't pay really very much attention to style or voice. And one of the things that I think characterizes my work, just like it characterized the work of Italo Calvino, is an attempt to sort of remake the writing, at every instance of the writing. In that sense, it's more about method than it is about a voice. And Hendrix wasn't like that. Very much just like the way that it's easy to identify a Hendrix guitar solo. It's also easy to identify Hendrix lyrical style. And I'm going to see if I can find, I'm going to have to move from this page, but I'm going to see if I can find the note itself. Well, there's not physical documentation, but here's the last stanza. "The story of life is quicker than the wink of an eye." That's very canned and trite, and he didn't write that way, right? It's also very, how to put it, without overly racializing it, it's a very white way of thinking. It's very abstract. It's canned. "The story of love is hello and goodbye until we meet again." I just don't see anything Hendrix in that. Maybe if I saw the rest of the note, but I don't know where that would be. Maybe I can find one on the web. Let's see. this is interesting. The story of life lyrics, the story of Jesus. This is also interesting because if this is the note, I don't recall Jimi Hendrix ever discussing Jesus in any of the lyrical content that I'm familiar with. And this doesn't read anything like a Hendrix lyric. So this is what Eric Burdon actually claimed to have found. I'm pretty sure that Eric Burdon wrote it, or someone wrote it and planted it for him to find. Because this doesn't read like Hendrix, does it? I mean, certainly there's got to be someone out there familiar enough with Hendrix's work to recognize that this is not a Hendrix coinage. Even the rhymes are nothing like the way that Hendrix rhymes in his work, right? Especially beyond Axis Bold as Love, where he really starts to find himself as a writer, right? Rising Sun is a Hendrix figure, but really easy to just stick in there. And isn't it interesting that Rising Sun, the House of the Rising Sun, also has another Burden reference, doesn't it? Very interesting. Angels of Heaven. You know, it's interesting because are these angles of heaven? I don't think that's more like a move that I would make, but this could just be a typo. But what's interesting about the construction, angles of heaven, as opposed to just angels of something else, is that, Hendrix didn't talk about, angels of in that way. Angels came down from heaven. But he's talking about the movement, not about the location, because he was a fairly decent writer, right? So he wouldn't need to specify that angels come from heaven. Flying saucers to some. Yeah, the space references are there in Hendrix, but usually they're much more subtle and interesting than that. And I don't ever remember them being made in relationship to these Christian sort of semantic fields. All right, so that's just more confirmation from the formal point of view that this isn't really a note from Hendrix. And that's just the Eric Burdon part of the story. Then there's, the woman that Hendrix was living with, and inconsistencies in her testimony, and the profoundly, volatile relationship they were having, especially, in that last part of Hendrix's life. And then the most troubling thing for me is the inconsistency around the reports from the medical establishment itself, including the operators of the emergency vehicle. So I want to see if I can find that so that people won't just believe that I'm making any of this up. All right, well, it's all over this Wikipedia article, and Wikipedia isn't the best, but some of the inconsistencies are documented here. So the question that I have is regarding the discrepancy between time of death and the reported, details of the emergency medical assistance. Okay, so Hendricks was pronounced dead at 12:45 p.m. on Friday, September 18th, 1970, right? Bless you. Bless you. The details of the ambulance arrival. All right, so before moving on to the disparities in the time frame of the arrival of emergency vehicles and the pronouncement of death, I feel that we first need to look at the final and to the extent possible definitive verdict for the result of the inquest that occurred on September 23rd, and the conclusions of that inquest resulting the cause of Jimi Hendrix's death. And the statement that's given, I mean, I'm sure that there's a much more elaborate description, and I'm positive that there is a much more comprehensive statement, but the evidence that we're looking at is extremely limited, and I'm using the Wikipedia page, which is certainly not the most scholarly of sources in any way, shape, or form, as anyone who's looked at the pages of those one is familiar with in personal life. They're highly manipulated and can be highly manipulated to the advantages of individuals and their various vanities. But in this case, this is the evidence that we're looking at, and this is the statement that comes from that particular source. So the comments of the coroner at the inquest describes this. The cause of death was clearly inhalation of vomit due to barbiturate intoxication, and there is no evidence as to the intention to commit suicide. If the question of intention cannot be answered, then it is proper to find the cause of death and leave it an open verdict. In any case, we know this, that it was the aspiration of vomit, the inhalation of vomit caused by the barbiturate poisoning. Whether that barbiturate poisoning was intentional or not depends on statements of various individuals associated with Hendrix, whose motives and statements are highly open to question. Right? Okay, so that we don't know, and is highly suspect. However, we do know this, that if this is indeed the cause of death, it would have been very simple for someone on the scene to have cleared the mouth and throat of Hendrix of the debris of the vomit, and with minimal assistance, would have been able to save his life. Now, whether this is someone that was there on the scene prior to the arrival of emergency services or not, that is open to question. But I want to look at the time frame and statements made by the medical professionals regarding this time frame, and analyze those discrepancies as examples of a series, right, of questionable statements that seem to be there to protect them from responsibility of death rather than recording the actual occurrences as they would have likely occurred in real time. And let me be really clear about this and why we're looking at the death of Hendrix in this instance. It's my contention that that Hendrix's death, just like the death of African Americans today at the hands of police with guns willing to kill African American youth and adult, particularly male, but not limited to male members of the African American community, right? Because many women have been murdered by the police as well. That, like those deaths, the death of Jimi Hendrix was, in effect, overdetermined by the racist society in which he struggled to maintain his integrity as a creative artist, and in which one can't say for certain, but the likelihood that the result of lack of care on the part of emergency services, the likelihood that this was largely a result of the fact of racial discrimination, seems great to me. And I have always contended that Jimi Hendrix is one of these individuals, as so eloquently described by Antonin Artaud in his article on Vincent van Gogh, one of these individuals who was, whether it was an actual suicide or not, suicided by society. I prefer the term murder, but let's look at the time frame, and then I can go on to address questions of depression and Hendrix's own description of why he was depressed, which was as a result of his relationship to the music industry, both the economics and the racial biases within the music industry, right, as opposed to the way that the medical establishment wanted to frame his depression and it's leading to drug use as a result of some other organic or brain imbalance cause, right? And which is the point of the work that we do is to investigate these things and to point and draw attention to these discrepancies. And so we'll look at the time frame, and then I want to return to this idea of the way that even highly creative and relatively successful individuals who continue to be marginalized in various ways by both industry and institutions of law and institutions of other kinds of institutions as well, and other kinds of relationships to media. The results of these continuous successions of trauma often get overlooked, or what I would call missorted into or organic or other types of social and personalized, right, explanations that discount the way that in fact that society is responsible for the demise of these individuals. And so that's what we want to look at. And so now I need to find the time frame for that's given by the medical establishment. All right, so there's an initial time given that police officers responded to a call for assistance from the ambulance control center And there's a final designation of the confirmation and the pronouncement of Jimi Hendrix's death at 12:45 p.m., right? The more specific time frames relate to emergency service arrivals and emergencies and arrivals at the hospital. The initial designation for the emergency service arrival is 11:35, and the arrival at the hospital is supposedly 11:45. Then the story becomes interesting because in the first series of statements, Hendrix is described as unresponsive. So presumably that those descriptions were made at 11:45 or at the time that the police initially made this visit at 11:35. So whether that was 11:35 or 11:45 that he was pronounced unresponsive is difficult to say. Then later, the statements become modified, and the later statements describe Hendrix as dead on arrival at 11:45 and absolve emergency crews from and paramedics from all responsibility of the death. It's my contention that if in fact he was dead at 11:45, that the official pronouncement of death, even if on arrival at the hospital at 11:45, further attempts had been made to revise him, that the pronouncement of death would have been made much earlier than 12:45, an hour after recognition that Hendrix was in fact dead. So the discrepancy in my mind is rather large and blaring like a siren. And admittedly, I pay very close attention to the details of these kinds of numbers and time as a result of what I do. And the discrepancy may not seem so obvious to someone who doesn't pay so much attention to the details of time and space and distances from places and likelihoods of manipulation of data based on the relationships between those numbers as they relate to transportation in time and space, and as they relate to responsibility that one might have had, or many individuals might have had, for failing to even attempt to revive Hendrix. So this is the first pair of discrepancies, and then the other thing that I would want to call attention to is the fact that a lot is discussed about possible etiologies of depression, that may have led to use of drugs, and what isn't stated in these descriptions largely and what doesn't occur in that note that we read about Jesus is that in his own statements, discussing some of the difficulties that he was having, sleeping, and doing his work, many of those difficulties belong to the industry, and that's the way that Hendrix described it. So for evidence, there are a lot of different sources to look, to justify the fact that Hendrix's depression and his self-description of nervous breakdowns were the result of his relationship to the music industry. You could even begin with the interview that he does following the performance of the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock, and the discussion of that on the Dick Cavett show. Listen to it very closely, and even in that public document, there's evidence that his self-description involved a relationship with the music industry, and the implications in that, once again, if you read between the lines, are the racialized biases within the music industry. And let me make it clear what I'm saying in presenting this information. I'm not saying that there's clear evidence that any one individual or even conspiracy of individuals can be clearly held accountable for the death of Jimi Hendrix in terms of the legalities of the responsibility of what would constitute an act of murder. However, what I'm saying is that Hendrix's death was overdetermined by the racist society, which both produced him and destroyed him, and that it was overdetermined in at least the following ways: that he was his personal experience didn't sit well within the expectations and desires of the music industry, particularly his relationship with Warner Brothers, and that was racial. His relationship to white musicians, particularly within the kind of blues-inspired rock that he performed in, for example, the Rolling Stones. There are numerous stories that mark descriptions of fellow musicians using extraordinarily offensive racialized terms to describe Hendrix, and his white girlfriend at the time of the incident is also reported as having used these similar offensive terms. Now, probably individuals who haven't had a life history of being tormented for difference or marginalized positionalities that they occupy will not get, how traumatizing the repeated violence of assault, verbal assault, and physical assault is, and the toll that those traumatizing repetitions take. On the subject of those acts of violence. However, I'm also certain that individuals who have experienced the social effects of those marginalized positionalities will understand and comprehend what living a life subject to, the continual assault of prejudiced social forces can really mean. So those are, two areas, and then the other areas that, in my mind, seem rather, clearly responsible for Hendrix's death, involve the failure to do the obvious right thing and to perform, the minimal amount of care that would have been required to save his life. And then, of course, the aftermath of that is also, and I'm saying this, yes, I'm saying that this is a racial factor. If he were white, would the ambulance drivers have paid more attention to his immediate situation and assisted him further? I very much suspect that would have been the case. And I'm not saying that it was even conscious on their part, but I believe that he would have received a lot better care if, he had been a different color. And that's a function of the racialized imbalances of our society as well, right? So those are the contributions, leading up to the occurrence of his death that I want to describe as being over-determined by the forces of racism in American and society abroad as well, obviously. And by pointing to the fact that Jimi Hendrix died in London, I'm not attempting to relieve the responsibilities of the racism that he experienced in the United States. I'm merely attempting to point to the fact that he couldn't escape it. That there was no place in the terms that I've discussed in relationship to dystopias and utopias, in the phrase somewhere better than this, nowhere better than this. There was nowhere better than this. And that's not to speak positively of the lack of the agency, that racism played in the United States in the death of Hendrix, but rather to speak of the general dystopia of biases and injustice. That couldn't really that one couldn't really leave behind, inescapable in a sense. And this occurred in London, but it might as well. I mean, that's not the right way to put it, but it could have occurred anywhere. Anywhere that these biases and institutionalized forms of violence existed and continue to exist, obviously. And if they didn't continue to exist, there would be no reason to discuss them. And if the violences that I've received in my life didn't apply to others, there would be no reason to discuss those either. So overdetermination is the point that we're leading to, and it's a big point in the discussion of racism, because in the instance of someone like Ahmaud Arbery, there's clearly an individual responsibility for his murder. Two white males chased him for 5 minutes, cornered him, and brutally murdered him, and are responsible for his death and should be convicted of the crime of murder. In Hendrix's case, the overdetermination doesn't necessarily lead to a simple verdict in that way, and yet it doesn't absolve the participants in the violence against Hendrix and the systematic pressure that led to despair and the use of drugs either, clearly. And there was, you could say, well, it was the 60s and psychedelics. It's one thing experimenting with psychedelics and hallucinogenic drugs, whether one is pro or con on that issue, right? But as mind expanding and liberating, tools of visionary consciousness and the suppression of feelings of shame, self-hatred, depression, hurt with barbiturates. Now, and again, this is something that you'll either get or you won't get, right? And if you've worked in the mental health industry, and no expressions like comorbidity, you'll get it, more, or self-medication, you'll get it more than if you haven't worked in those industries, and you'll get it more if you've worked in those industries than if you've just read a little bit of Freud, but whether you get it or not, I want to pose that, because I think it's in a way it's an easy way out to say, well, Hendrix was, he got interested in these drugs, and it was the 60s, and and that's just the way it was, and some of this had consequences. Well, there's a very different, taking LSD in the way that Aldous Huxley did, right? The Doors of Perception and all that nonsense. But there's a very different telos in that gesture than like continuing to have to self-medicate or continuing to try to find some release from the onslaught of these traumatic forces that clearly like Hendrix was subject to, right? And so that's my counter argument to the other in advance of the counter argument to that. And then finally, before moving on to my own experiences, and we'll probably do that in another talk, because once again we're moving away from my technological ability to put this up on the web in terms of time. But Hendrix's girlfriend at the time, I don't know how to pronounce her name, Daneman or Daneman or Danman. Again, the testimony is extremely contradictory, self-contradictory, and changes, as the initial idea of suicide and the suicide note, sort of becomes questionable, and then the story changes, and later, she says that Hendrix had taken 9 of her prescribed, I don't know this drug, but Vesperax, sleeping tablets, which is a kind of barbiturate. So the obvious reason is that he wasn't sleeping because he was under considerable amount of stress, and I've already attempted to describe why that stress existed for him. But listeners and viewers of my work will recognize in the 9, we've been talking a lot about 9, and using the 7th track from Access Bold as Love is titled If 6 Was 9, and I've made multiple references to that track, and I've used it as a formal device in a number of poems, and I want it to be clear that in this transposition of 6 to 9 and 9 to 6 that we've been working with, that I want it to be clear that lurking behind that formal device is this story and this claim that Hendrix had taken these 9 sleeping tablets, and reciprocally, in the formal transposition of 6 to 9, I have transposed the 9s to 6s, and very, very deeply implicitly in the formal construct is a question. What if the 9 had been 6? Would Hendrix have survived? Would Jimi Hendrix have survived? And we don't even know if this story is true, and that he took them or she gave them to him. In some way, she must have given them to him because they were her prescription. But I suppose even deeper in the question, if 9 were 6, had he survived? Is the question, how many times, did he have to receive these, assaults in the press and by fellow musicians, and receive the trauma of repeatedly being referred to in these outrageously offensive terms, and before the depression would have set in, how many times? So how many times, was was Hendrix disparaged, or, as this discussed on the Dick Cavett show, they received threatening phone calls, after or whatever, because of his social political engagement, with the civil rights movement and, anti, Vietnam sentiment. And if there were 900, moments of traumatization, what if there had only been 600? In his life. If there were 9,000 moments of racial trauma in his life, what if there had only been 6,000? We know that there were not even close to merely 9. But if there were 9 major contributions made on the part of a discriminatory and oppressive society, what if there had only been 6 contributions? And these are the hidden questions that I want to ask and address and reveal. And I know that they're the questions that will be ignored, and that I know that I'll just receive more offensive response, and maybe maybe if I hadn't made this video, I would only get assaulted 6 more times. But after having made it, I anticipate that it'll maybe go to 9, because that's the way it works. That's the way silencing works, and that's why all this offensive stuff shows up on my YouTube videos that shouldn't even have ads in the first place, or why it's stolen by whoever is stealing it and putting it up in Russian bot forums, right? Because when you speak of these things, then just like Hendrix, the society it very much rallies its resources to stop you from speaking further. And then with that, we'll stop for today, because I really want to talk about my own experience with intoxication poisoning, and an incident from around 1980 in which I also wasn't In fact, I wasn't even transported to a hospital. Emergency services wasn't called, and I very easily could have died. Found myself, when I awoke, I awoke alone and abandoned, and I recognize in myself, Hendrik's demise, and how easily, I could have suffered the same fate, and probably largely just out of, the fear and lack of responsibility of, a few individuals, who were supposed to be friends, but apparently, like in the stories that readjust the time frames and the numbers, didn't want to be responsible. And effectively, left me in a place for dead, I assume. But we'll discuss it. We'll discuss it further, and elsewhere, and bring the overdetermination of Hendrik's death and the underdetermination, in a sense, of my own survival together in a way that I hope to be useful